So let's talk about the Byrds. Let's rank the Byrds. Not let's. I'm going to rank the Byrds for you because the Byrds are one of my three favorite all-time bands. The Beatles, the Kinks, and the Byrds. The Byrds and the Kinks sort of flip back and forth between second and third, but how can you rate music? I'm doing it here because people seem to enjoy it, but of course it's so subjective, and every time I do these kind of lists, I realize, oh, I should have included that, or I get comments, you forgot this one. I think that's a good thing. I like the difference of opinions. So we're going to talk the Byrds. Since they have a finite catalog in terms of, they have 12 studio albums, so I'm including all of them. The other videos I've done on Bob Dylan and Beatles solo albums, the other ranking videos, I've narrowed it down to the 13 to 15 best, and then ranked them, because I don't want to go on like with Bob Dylan 50 plus records and go through it. So enough of that. Before I start, I like to always include several comps or things that I just kind of, I'm not including that I think that are really interesting. One, obviously this Best of the Byrds was a great record. I bought this as a young lad, and it's just a wonderful collection of their early singles from 65, 66, and 67. Now, the Byrds were, in a way, America's answer to the Beatles. Not even an answer, but they gave the Beatles a run for the money in terms of quality and singles and originality, different take on it. Basically, single-handedly created folk rock, or at least it is what the critics or the press at the time referred to as folk rock. Also, I do want to show a couple other things. This is a UK comp that came out in the 70s, History of the Byrds. This uses the cover of the American Best of the Byrds Volume 2. This is a second generation. I mean, there's a couple little, I'm not going to get into the whole history of the Byrds. That's for other videos and for some great books out there about that. But this is what I call the Great Byrds Band 2. And I'll talk about them a little later. But this is a double record comp, and it really is a great overview if you can find this. This is long out of print. This came out in 1973 on CBS in the UK. And it's got the great family tree, and I forgot the guy's name. Back in the 70s, this guy was doing these family trees for a lot of rock and roll records, and it's really great just to see the whole thing, whether it's the Byrds, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Graham Parsons, the whole history family tree of what begat this. Jim McGuinn, who later changed his name to Roger McGuinn, comes from the whole folk rock scene, played with Judy Collins, was a folk singer, was a folk guitar player, and a great one. And then also I do want to showcase this. This might be out of print. This is an amazing Sundays comp of all their mono singles, A and B sides. It's a double album, and it has all the great singles, the singles version. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Again, I'm not going to get into the minute details of the recordings or the different mixes, because I just want to rank the albums from my point of view. And remember, the reason I'm doing these two, which is a little different from other people who rank these, and not that it's unique, but I grew up with these records, so I bought them all as they came out. So it's a little different take on how you see a band where, all of a sudden you're, 20 years old and you stumble across a band that's, from 40 years ago or 30 years ago, and you get them into them differently. So a lot of times it's what your life was about your memories, which I, pontificate a lot in my videos about memories. It's a big, important part of this music and how and why I got into it. Okay, so the 12 albums by the Byrds. Number 12, Further Along. This was their last album of the final group of the Byrds, aside from the 1973 reunion album, which I am including here. This is my least favorite album. And again, let me say this. None of the Byrds albums are bad, but some of them, they all have some great tunes. This is, again, probably their least inspiring record. This is recorded, this came out in 1971, and this was the last album, and then they broke up. This is recorded in London. It was somewhat a stripped down affair, very few overdubs, live in London in a studio. And in a way, it was a reaction to Byrds Maniacs, which had come out just prior to this, which I'll talk about. And there's a reason for that, them going back to that stripped down effect. This is the last incarnation of the Byrds, aside from the reunion album. And I love this version of it. And some people don't really dig, they go back to the early folk rock days. This is more the country days. And then also psychedelic, and in a way they became a jam band during their live shows in 70, 71, which was a great time to see the Byrds. Of course, Roger McGuinn, Gene Parsons, Clarence White, and Skip Batten were members of the band there. They do some old country songs like Further Along, Tiffany Queen, some original songs, America's Great National Pastime, which is almost like not even a country song. I don't even can describe what it is. It's kind of a goof of a song, a fun song, a little gimmicky, I would say. Bugler is a kind of interesting song too. So, I like some of this record. I don't play it often. I go back to it, and every time I play it, there's a couple of tracks that stand out. So number 12, Further Along. Number 11, the reunion album. I was so excited when I heard that the original 5 members of the Byrds were getting back together. This is when Asylum Records started, David Geffen's new label early on in the early 70s. This came out in 1973. I almost said 4. 1973. And of course, the original members of the Byrds, Michael Clarke, Gene Clark, Roger Jim McGuinn, Chris Hillman, and David Crosby. This is somewhat problematic album because I really wanted it to be a more cohesive record. Even on the early Byrds albums, they weren't as tight as we think they were, because Gene Clark was the primary songwriter early on and gifted songwriter, so his stuff was different. But all those records had all of them singing these just beautiful, amazing, gorgeous harmonies, which attracted me and everyone else to. The opening track, Full Circle, is a song written by Gene Clark, and it's a great, great song. This is various early 70s sort of country rock album more than anything else, unlike the folk rock period. So it sort of mixes the various sides of the Byrds, not psychedelic at all, but the folk rock merging in more to the country rock. There's several covers on here. There's 2 Neil Young songs, including kind of a nice version of Cowgirl in the Sand that, it certainly doesn't better the Neil Young version. It closes out with the song See the Sky About to Rain, another Neil Young song. In fact, there's also Sweet Mary, a song written by Roger McGuinn and Jacques Levy, who I'll talk about in a later record. Several more Gene Clark songs, and a cover of For Free, a Joni Mitchell song on here. So it's a good record. It's just missing something. I just remember, and part of it is memory at the time when it came out. I was so disappointed with this record because I wanted this great, just magnificent Byrds soaring harmonies, and it was a little lazy in my opinion. So the Byrds reunion album from 1973, in at number 11. Number 10, Dr. Birds and Mr. Hyde. This is one of 2 records that they had a bass player, John York, on. He only lasted for 2 records. This Wheel on Fire is an interesting cover version. Again, yet another Dylan song, a song written by Bob Dylan and Rick Danko of the band. It's a pretty good version, but it's not magnificent like, the Byrds have done a lot of Dylan covers over the years. In fact, there was in the 70s a comp, a Bob Dylan comp on Columbia Records. The Byrds do Dylan, and it's a collection of all their up to that point songs that they covered by Bob Dylan, because they were sort of the, aside from Peter, Paul, and Mary, and a few other artists, they were the group that really pushed Dylan songs into the forefront of the world more than Bob Dylan initially, because it was more accessible than Bob Dylan's, since some people aren't into his voice. There's a cool song that does start side 2. My first hearing of that song was on the Woodstock album, and it's called Drugstore Truck Driving Man. It's a song actually co-written by Roger McGuinn and Graham Parsons. There's in that short-lived, tempestuous collaboration with the Byrds and Graham Parsons, which I'll talk about a little later. Nashville West, Old Blue, Song About a Dog. You know, there's some great songs on here, and it is a good album. Yeah, this album has a little bit of a, actually, the Dr. Birds and Mr. Hyde is a perfect title because it wants to be country and it wants to be psychedelic. Does it make it sort of cowboy psychedelic or psychedelic folk or psychedelic country? Maybe. Doesn't quite gel totally like that, but it's still an interesting album. So coming in at number 10, Dr. Birds and Mr. Hyde from Columbia Records. Coming in at number 9. Now, I like this record more than most people like the record. I got this record right when it came out, and it was different. And the things I noticed about, there's horns and there's orchestration and there's, gospel choirs on it, which the Byrds turned out they hated it. They had recorded this record produced by Terry Melcher, who they had brought back, who had produced their hit albums, their first hit albums for Columbia, like Mr. Tambourine Man, Turn, Turn, Turn. And they went on tour, recorded this record. Terry Melcher goes in without their permission, apparently, and without them knowing, and adds gospel choirs, orchestration. It's a big sounding record. Of course, the Byrds hated it. I would love to have a stripped down version of this to really see what it's about. I think Terry Melcher said something about they were kind of lackluster in the studio, so he thought it needed something. I actually like it, but a lot of people don't. And I love this cover. I love these sort of like silver blue life masks. This is that last version of the Byrds lineup as well, with Skip Batten, Clarence White, Roger McGuinn, and Gene Parsons. I like this version of the Byrds. Now, Glory Glory was a somewhat of a hit. It's a very gospel-like song, and it's very kind of religious and really a wonderful opening track. Citizen Kane ends side 1. I think that's a Skip Batten song. Skip Batten wrote several songs on a couple of these Byrds albums that he co-wrote with the L.A. Punkster producer Kim Fowley. Kim Fowley, you may know because he sort of pulled together and created the Runaways, amongst other illustrious LA groups at the time in the 70s. But Citizen Kane's kind of a gimmicky, bizarre song with horns and just a really wonky track. But I remember being 16 years old when this came out, I think 16 or 17, and kind of liking that track. It's really fun. Opened up with side 2 with I Want to Grow Up to Be a Politician. I love McGuinn's vocals on that. It's kind of a fun, with a big brass band interlude of a political rally type song, which is interesting. And, the other songs are okay. It closes up with a nice cover of Jamaica Say You Will, a song I've always loved, a song that was covered by a song that was covered by Tom Rush, and a song that was written by Jackson Browne, before Jackson Browne was kind of known to most of us. But Bird Maniac coming in at number 9. Coming number 8, The Ballad of Easy Rider. I mean, there's some incredible songs on this, and it was called this because they were trying to make a play after the success of the movie Easy Rider, which Roger McGuinn wrote several songs, and the Byrds feel is all through the soundtrack of Easy Rider, or through some of it and through the movie. In fact, Dylan was invited to write songs. I think it was Peter Fonda wanted Dylan to write a song, and he suggested Roger McGuinn. So The Ballad of Easy Rider was written by Roger McGuinn. It's such a gorgeous song. Also on this album is their version of Jesus Is Just All Right, which is a song that I really like. It's become, kind of a gospel-y religious number later in the 70s, covered by the Doobie Brothers, amongst others. Another version of Dylan's song, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, which is good. It's a little lazy, in my opinion. Tulsa Country Blue, Deporte, which I believe is a Woody Guthrie song, and it closes out with a nice short ballad, just really beautiful, called Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. And of course, it's about the three astronauts that went to our first Apollo 11 moon landing. And it came out soon after that fall after that album. So not a bad record, but coming in at number 8 is the Ballad of Easy Rider, the Byrds. And this is the other album of 2 albums that John York plays bass on. Coming in at number 7, an album that I play a lot, and it's amongst my favorites. Of course, I love all the Byrds albums, and as I said, there's no bad Byrds album. There's just some that are better than others. I think this is an amazing record. This is Byrds Untitled, a double album that came out in 1970. This was a pretty successful album. I think part of it is one album is live and one is in the studio. And the live album was this time when, bands started coming out. Like soon after this would be the Allman Brothers at the Fillmore East, and all these, I think the Byrds could have gone on for years and years and become a really good jam band. And I mean that in all the good side of jam bands. Like, to me, when I've seen, obviously the Grateful Dead is one of the most famous and successful. I'm not a fan of Fish. I like some of their stuff, but I'm not a fan of Fish because I couldn't name a Fish song off the rack if you asked me to. But even bands, if you ever seen Los Lobos live, Los Lobos is a great, amazing American band. And on tour, they will cover the Beatles, a song from Revolver or some other things. And they really do their versions, unlike what the Grateful Dead used to do. And the Byrds do these great renditions, long renditions. In fact, on the live album, on side 2 of the concert side, they do an entire side of 8 Miles High with jam, great guitar interplay from Roger McGuinn on that Rickenbacker, and the great, amazing guitar playing of Clarence White. I love Clarence White. Nashville West, Lover of the Bayou, which is a great original song, also co-written by Jacques Levy and Roger McGuinn. I just love, and Mr. Tambourine Man, Mr. Spaceman, they were a great live band. I would have loved, I did not see this version of the Byrds. I saw in 1967 of the Byrds after Gene Clark left, which was great as a young kid, really one of my early concerts experience. But I would have loved to have seen one of their Fillmore shows this period here. There you go. Now the studio version of this has one of my all-time favorite Byrds songs, and that's Chestnut Mare. Chestnut Mare, to me, is a perfect record. It's ethereal, it's beautiful. If you listen on headphones to that song, listen to the acoustic guitar of Clarence White. It's surreal. It's magnificent, and it's so pretty. It's so gorgeous. Chestnut Mare, Lover of the Bayou. Some of the songs that at this period Roger McGuinn wrote with Jacques Levy. Jacques Levy was a theatrical, musical theater composer, and they were working on what was going to be sort of a country rock type of Broadway musical, and it never happened, but those songs were from that. And again, Chestnut Mare has been on so many comps. To me, it's one of the masterpieces in pop music of a record, and I just love that record. Just a Season's on here, Yesterday's Train, Hungry Planet, Truck Stop Girl, great country song, but I love this record. So coming in number 7, the Byrds, Untitled, from 1970. Incredible record. Coming number 6, folk rock at its finest, Turn, 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 their second album. Again, they followed this up in 1965. They followed up Mr. Tambourine in 1965, I should say. 2 records in 1 year. This was sort of the biggest, again, follow-up to the Beatles. They went to England, and they were pretty popular in England at the time and befriended the Beatles. And Roger McGuinn started playing, and I should talk about that more with Mr. Tambourine Man, picked up a Rickenbacker guitar, a Rickenbacker 360 12-string. Did he get the 360? I can't remember which Rickenbacker he got, but he picked up a Rickenbacker 12 string because seeing George Harrison in A Hard Day's Night, like so many other stars. And of course, you know, the Rickenbacker of the Byrds went on to influence groups like REM, Peter Buck on the 12 string. That jingle jangle thing started with this band. Even though the Beatles did it, people didn't really kind of refer to the Beatles, George Harrison's 12 string as a sort of a jingle jangle sound, although Harrison used it quite a bit, but it wasn't quite as upfront as what Jim McGuinn, who later changed his name to Roger McGuinn, would do. Of course, Turn, Turn, Turn is lyrics, or it's from the scripture, from the book of Ecclesiastes, and it was taken and Pete Seeger added music to it and turned it into a song. And this was a great arrangement. I believe that Roger McGuinn had done with Judy Collins, working with her for a number of years. Lay Down Your Worry Tune is a beautiful song. He was a friend of mine, which they would later change the name of this great, beautiful song to change it to refer to John Kennedy's assassination. Another Dylan song, The Times They Are A-Changin', was on here. It closes up with a song that is kind of interesting with banjo, Oh Susanna, the typical song Oh Susanna, but one of the great folk rock records of all time. This, unfortunately, would be the last time that Gene Clark and all the 5 Byrds would be on a complete album. I mean, he didn't last long. Gene Clark really was only 2.5 albums, not even, maybe 2.25. We'll talk about that a little later. But the Byrds, this is a fun album, coming at number 6. And coming at number 5 is Sweetheart of the Rodeo. This might be the most important record that the Byrds ever recorded. At least, if not important, the most influential record. It wasn't a hit at the time. It was their turn to country music. Originally, they were going to do a sort of a record, more of an expanded type record on almost like the history of American music. And it ended up being more just a country record, very influenced of the Nashville sound. Some Nashville musicians were brought in. Of course, this is where Graham Parsons enters the picture and really pushes the Byrd in a more traditional country side. This is billed after the fact as the first country rock ever. I think it would give, I think it would be almost a close tie with the Beau Brummels album, Bradley's Barn, another album you should check out if you're interested in 1968, sort of that new country and rock music collaboration. That was recorded, the Beau Brummels album was recorded at Owen Bradley's Barn, so there's some, legitimacy in that as well as this record. Of course, Graham Parsons did bring some Charlie Louvin songs to the mix and traditional country gospel stuff. This is a beautiful record. I did not understand this record. I did buy it when it came out. I didn't quite get it, and then I fell in love with it. A lot of people didn't get this record. I don't even know if it charted, and even the country stations didn't get it because it was, rock versus country were totally separate. In fact, the song I mentioned earlier, Drugstore Truck Driving Man, that Graham Parsons and Roger McGuinn wrote, was about this country DJ who just chastised this whole rock and roll music mixed in with country music. That's why it's kind of a cool song there, a little tidbit. You Ain't Going Nowhere, which is a really great song that opens the album. That's a Dylan song again. That bringing in Bob Dylan, it's just so great. The Christian Life, Lewin Brothers, just these great songs. Pretty Boy Floyd, Woody Guthrie's song, Hickory Wind. Hickory Wind may possibly be the best song Graham Parsons ever wrote. Of course, he brings it on later on his solo records. There's several original songs by Graham Parsons, as well as Nothing Was Delivered ends the record, another Bob Dylan tune as well. Life in Prison, Merle Haggard song. This is a true country record, country rock record, and it's such a beautiful record. Now, Graham Parsons sang a lot more songs than was released on this album, and because of partly contractual, partly Roger McGuinn getting pissed off with Graham Parsons, some of the versions were taken off, and Roger McGuinn sang lead vocals. There is a record store day version and an expanded CD version. That it's a double album that brings back all the versions, including all the versions with Graham Parsons singing. So that's number 5 on the best Byrds albums, ranked. The best Byrds album, the entire Byrds catalog, ranked. Coming in at number 4, the Notorious Byrd Brothers. Notice there's only 3 Byrds here. Does the horse represent David Crosby? There's some debate about that. He was kicked out of the group. He was kind of the wanker of the group at that time. This record is one of the great hybrid country psychedelic records. I think it's pretty close to a perfect record. Notorious Byrd Brothers there, Chris Hillman, Roger McGuinn, and drummer Michael Clark. Artificial energy. They were bringing the Moog synthesizer on here. There's some spacey effects. Going Back is, to me, the definitive version of this song written by Jerry Goffin, and Carole King. It's a perfect song. I tell you, I mean, Roger McGuinn wrote some great stuff, but they were great interpreters of other people's music, and they made them theirs. They made these songs almost a definitive version. I mean, could you say Tambourine Man's definitive version by the Byrds or Dylan? I mean, that's, they're both very important in so many ways. Wasn't Born to Follow, another great song on this album. I think that was used also in Easy Rider. That's beautiful. Old John Robertson. Tribal Gathering, which was the typical David Crosby hippie experimental out there song, and Space Odyssey, another psychedelic rendition. This is produced by Gary Usher. They went between Terry Melcher, Gary Usher, back to Terry Melcher for a while with a couple of other people. I'm escaping me right now. But this is a record that should be in everybody's collection who's into folk rock, somewhat country rock, and psychedelic country. It's so good. Major influence of artists like Marty Stewart later on, and Sturgill Simpson, I would say. Important record in their catalog, the Byrds, coming in at number 4. Coming in number 3 is one of the most important records also. I know I said that with Sweetheart, but this is the debut album by the Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man. Considered one of the great debut albums of any band ever. It's sort of the invention of folk rock, which wasn't really called folk rock until the press got onto this. On Mr. Tambourine Man, actually, the backup band was what would become the Wrecking Crew, because the label and originally Terry Melcher didn't feel the band was up to it. However, after that single, the entire band is on here, and they got great, and they made a great record. So, I mean, there's all this debate whether the Wrecking Crew student musicians were on the rest of it. I think it was only on Mr. Tambourine Man. I think there was a lot of sort of turbulence even at this early stage, because Gene Clark was writing most of the big hits and writing the great songs, so obviously was getting the majority of publishing and making more money than the rest of the band, because think about it, their big hit, Mr. Tambourine Man, and even later Turn, 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 were not original compositions. So Gene Clark had the majority of original compositions on these first couple records. But Spanish Harlem Incident as well. This is an original 2i, my original copy that I bought in 1965. Really great record. Spanish Harlem, of course, was a Dylan song. They do, Pete Seeger, Bells of Rhythm Neon here as well. This is just a really great record. All I really want to do was another single, a Bob Dylan song that they covered that really didn't light up the charts, didn't have fire on the charts. I think it did really better when Sonny and Cher actually covered it. This is just a really beautiful record. Chimes of Freedom, another Dylan song. So the thing is, they were doing these cover songs, but they were making it theirs. Again, the folk rock scene really kind of exploded here, and then after this, all these other bands kind of merged into that scene from LA, like the Turtles. The folk rock thing was happening. Of course, Tom Wilson, or is it Bob Johnson? Tom Wilson, I think, putting that drum track, that great guitar and drum track on Simon & Garfunkel's Sounds of Silence after the fact, and that became a hit. So the folk rock thing was exploding in 1965, really led by the great band, the Byrds, and their #3 album, Mr. Tambourine Man, possibly the invention of folk rock records. #2 and #1, I go back and forth on these two. These definitely could one could be one, they could reverse. But #2, I'm going with Younger Than Yesterday. Younger Than Yesterday, there's more Moog, there's a little bit of Moog synthesizers, there's more psychedelia add in, more pop sound. This is produced by Gary Usher, so they had switched producers by this time. And it's really a great record. So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star was a pretty big hit for the Byrds all over the radio. It was sort of their reaction to the Monkees, to a rock band being created, like mass produced, as you will. Have You Seen Your Face is great. Renaissance Fair is beautiful. Everyone's Been Burned. Mind Gardens, it's very psychedelic. Now, their version of My Back Pages, which is another incredible song by Bob Dylan, it's just sublime on here. The Girl with No Name, a Chris Hillman song. Why, co-produced by Roger McGuinn and David Crosby. Of course, at this time, Roger was still Jim McGuinn, and for some kind of religious, secular back and forth purposes, he went from Jim McGuinn to Roger McGuinn. But this is a fine album. So, Younger Than Yesterday, #2. So, leave it on there, Mazzy. Look at that. Psychedelic. Coming in at #1, an album that I remember playing over and over again when I first got it, right when it came out. It was Fifth Dimension, 5D, Fifth Dimension. This is early on in the recording of this record, or after the single, I think. Gene Clark left the group. He was writing most of the songs, getting most of the publishing, as I said, but he started writing this wonderful title track, not really title track, but this wonderful single, 8 Miles High. It should have been a bigger hit. It's one of the best singles of the 1960s. This is probably considered the first psychedelic album of the 1960s, or ever, in a way. That song was influenced by John Coltrane and Ravi Shankar. It's got Eastern sensibilities, the guitar riff in the middle, that wild, jangly 12-string guitar that's just so frenetic. It's so much like a Coltrane solo from this time. They were listening to Coltrane records and Ravi Shankar records, and that was a big influence. But Roger McGuinn and David Crosby finished the song, and there's a whole lot of stories about what they contributed or didn't contribute. But 8 Miles High is a perfect rock and roll record. I love that song. Maybe the first great psychedelic singles, as I said. Wild Mountain Time, so they still have the folk rock thing, Mr. Spaceman, What's Happening. They do a version of Hey Joe. Hey Joe had been covered by so many bands, in the mid-'60s, and they do a nice version of it that David Crosby sings. John Riley is a beautiful folk song. 242 Foxtrot, Learjet songs, kind of a gimmicky final ode. A lot of these psychedelic albums in the mid-'60s to late '60s would put these almost like sound montages out on records that weren't sort of complete songs on their own. But unfortunately, Gene Clark's not even on the cover of this record, but this is my favorite Byrds record. The Byrds from 1966. Fifth Dimension. There you go. The Byrds ranked all 12 of their records, plus a few comp records you should check out. Love this band, the great American band of the 1960s. So enjoy it. Would you change the order? Any other comments? Mazzy loves you.